The harbor city believed it could not be touched. By tradition, Tyre had stood for many centuries. Its founding date is itself uncertain, half a mile off the coast of what is now Lebanon, its strongest walls reportedly rising straight out of the Mediterranean to a height of around 150 feet, as the ancient sources recorded. No army on earth had ever forced its way inside. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon is said by tradition to have besieged it for some 13 years and walked away with nothing. The Tyrians watched a young Macedonian king march down the coast in the winter of 332 before the Common Era, and they were not afraid, because they had something no conqueror had ever overcome. They had the sea. By the time that king was finished, 9 out of every 10 people who defended that island were dead, and the island itself was no longer an island at all. The king was Alexander III of Macedon, 24 years old, fresh from shattering the Persian army at Issus. And the thing he did at Tyre was not an act of war in the way we usually imagine it. It was an act of engineering so audacious that it changed the geography of the coastline permanently. You can still walk the land he made today. So how did a man with no navy worth the name, facing the most defensible city in the ancient world, build a road through the open ocean to reach a wall that touched the sky? And why did almost every soul behind that wall end up dead or enslaved? Here is what I am going to show you. First, why Tyre genuinely was the closest thing the ancient world had to an unconquerable fortress, and the specific reason Alexander could not simply walk away from it the way Nebuchadnezzar did. Second, the exact mechanism of the causeway, the half-mile mole Alexander ordered his men to build straight across the seabed, and the moment the Tyrians turned that engineering marvel into a death trap. Third, the naval reversal that nobody saw coming. The day Alexander acquired a fleet the sources number at around 200 warships almost overnight without building a single one, a figure modern historians treat as approximate. Fourth, the final assault through a breach in the wall, and the precise decision that turned a military victory into one of the most merciless reckonings of the entire campaign. And fifth, the casualty arithmetic, why roughly 90% of the defenders may have died, a disputed figure I will return to and reconstruct from the ancient totals rather than treat as fact. What happened to the roughly 30,000 the sources say survived, and the strategic reason Alexander chose to make an example of this one city above all the others he ever took. A note before we go further. I am a narrator of history, not an archaeologist, and the ancient accounts of Tyre come to us mainly through writers like Arrian and Quintus Curtius Rufus, working centuries after the fact. Arrian, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, drew on the lost memoirs of Ptolemy and Aristobulus, 2 men who actually marched with Alexander, which is why historians lean on him most heavily. Curtius wrote in Latin, probably under the early emperors, and reached for drama where Arrian reached for the map. The figures they record should be read as the ancient sources report them, not as a modern census. Where the numbers are disputed, I will say so. Let me show you why this city should have been impossible. Tyre sat on an island roughly half a mile from the mainland shore. Not a low, sandy island you could wade to, but a rocky platform ringed by walls that, on the seaward side facing the city's 2 harbors, were among the tallest fortifications in the known world. Arrian, in his Anabasis, gives the seaward wall a height of around 150 feet, a figure recorded by the ancient source rather than a modern measurement. To put that in human terms, that is the height of a 15-story building faced in dressed stone, rising directly out of salt water with no beach in front of it to set a ladder on. The water between the island and the coast was deep enough that no siege tower could be rolled across it, and no battering ram could reach the stone. A siege tower of the period might stand 60 or 80 feet tall and weigh many tons. It needed flat, firm ground to move, and there was none, only open channel. To attack Tyre, you needed ships, And to win with ships, you needed to defeat the Tyrian navy in its own waters, and Tyre was a Phoenician city, which meant the sea was not a barrier they tolerated, but the medium they had mastered. These were the people who had founded Carthage some centuries before, and who, as Herodotus relates in his histories, the circumnavigation account appears in Book 4, are said to have circumnavigated Africa on behalf of an Egyptian pharaoh in vessels they built themselves, though Herodotus himself reports the tale with reservations. Their sailors were the finest in the Mediterranean. The purple dye that made the city rich, the famous Tyrian purple, extracted drop by drop from the murex sea snail, came from the water, was carried on the water, and made the city the trading hub of the Eastern Sea. Their two harbors, one facing north towards Sidon and called the Sidonian harbor, and one facing south called the Egyptian harbor, could shelter and launch a fleet that could strike any attacker from two directions at once. So the city had height, depth, distance, and seamanship all working for it at the same time. Take any one of those away and Tyre is merely strong. Together, they made it the fortress that had humiliated Babylon. Consider what Nebuchadnezzar's 13 years actually meant. The most powerful empire of the 6th century before the Common Era sat outside those walls for longer than most ancient wars lasted in total, and the ending, as the passage traditionally cited as Ezekiel chapter 29 verse 18 describes it, was that the Babylonian army had worn the hair off their heads and the skin off their shoulders hauling siege equipment and got nothing for it, a reading of that verse on which scholars do not all agree. Tyre, by tradition, negotiated a face-saving settlement and kept its independence. That was the precedent every Tyrian carried in his head as Alexander appeared on the shore. The greatest king of the previous age had broken his army on this rock and gone home empty-handed. Now you might reasonably ask the question the Tyrians themselves asked. Why did Alexander not just go around it? He was marching to conquer the Persian Empire. Tyre was one city on a long coast. The answer is the hinge on which this entire siege turns, and it is the first open loop I want you to hold on to. Alexander could not afford to leave Tyre behind him, and the reason was the Persian fleet. Persia's navy was largely Phoenician, crewed and supplied by cities exactly like Tyre. The great king had perhaps 300 or 400 warships at his disposal in the eastern Mediterranean, and the best of them, the fastest crews, the hardest fighting marines, were Phoenician and Cypriot. Alexander, by contrast, had crossed into Asia with a fleet the sources put at only around 160 ships, a figure historians treat as approximate, and he had taken the extraordinary step of disbanding most of it early in the campaign. He simply could not match Persia at sea, and he knew it. So he made the unconventional decision to defeat the enemy navy from dry land. As long as those coastal ports remained unconquered, the Persian fleet could operate freely. A warship of that era, a trireme with 170 rowers, or the heavier quadriremes and quinquiremes coming into use, could not stay at sea for long. It carried little water and less food. The crews needed to sleep ashore most nights, and the hulls needed regular beaching to dry out and to be scraped clean of the weed and worm that slowed them. A galley fleet without friendly harbors was a fleet on a countdown. It could cut Alexander's supply lines, it could ferry money and troops, and worst of all, it could sail to Greece and raise a rebellion at his back while he marched deeper into Asia. And the Spartan king Agis III was already taking Persian gold to do exactly that. Alexander's whole strategy was to defeat the Persian navy by capturing the land it depended on, to take the harbors and leave the ships with nowhere to refit, resupply, or shelter. Tyre was the strongest link in that chain. Leaving it intact meant leaving the Persian fleet a fortified base squarely on his flank. He did not besiege Tyre because he was stubborn. He besieged it because the entire campaign depended on it falling. He first tried diplomacy. Alexander sent envoys and asked reasonably to enter the city and offer a sacrifice at the temple of Melkart, the Tyrian Heracles, a god he claimed as an ancestor through his own descent from Heracles on his father's side. This was not a casual request. It was loaded with meaning. The temple of Melkart was the spiritual heart of Tyre, and the king who sacrificed there would be making a public claim to lordship over the city. The Tyrians understood that perfectly. They refused. They would not admit any Macedonian or any Persian inside their walls. They offered, as a compromise, that he could sacrifice at the old city on the mainland instead, where an older shrine to the god stood. It was a polite way of telling a king he was not welcome, and a way of staying neutral between Alexander and Darius, betting that the war would pass them by while they sat safe on their rock. According to the sources, Alexander's envoys were killed and their bodies thrown from the walls into the sea. Whatever the precise insult, the message was clear: the island would not open its gates. And so, Alexander made a decision that no commander before him had been mad enough to attempt. If he could not cross the water, he would remove the water. He would build a road to the island. This is the mechanism, and it is the heart of the whole story. So let me walk you through exactly how it worked. Alexander ordered the construction of a mole, a causeway, an artificial land bridge running from the mainland straight out across the channel to the island, a distance of about half a mile, some 800 meters of open sea. His engineers had a ready supply of material, because the old mainland city of Tyre, the original settlement that the Greeks called Palateris, or Old Tyre, had been largely abandoned when the population moved to the island for safety. Alexander had it torn down. The stone from its houses and its walls went into the sea, hauled in carts and on the backs of laborers, and tipped into the channel. Timber came from the cedar forests of Lebanon, the same legendary cedars whose wood had built Solomon's temple and the Phoenician fleets, dragged down from the mountain slopes by ox teams. Rubble, rock, felled trees, and rammed earth were driven into the channel, and slowly, agonizingly, a strip of dry land began to crawl out from the coast toward the towering walls. The labor force was enormous. The men of the army supplemented by levies from the surrounding territory, now under Macedonian control. And Alexander, who understood that soldiers will dig harder for a king who shares the work, was reported to be on the mole himself, marking out the line and praising the men who carried the heaviest loads. Near the shore, where the water was shallow, the work went quickly. The seabed there was soft mud. The depth was manageable at only a few feet, and the Tyrians at first watched from a comfortable distance, secure in the belief that this was the folly of a frustrated young man. They reportedly sailed close in light boats and jeered, asking whether Alexander thought himself greater than the sea god, whether he meant to outdo Poseidon. But as the mole pushed further out, two things happened that turned an engineering project into a nightmare. The water deepened, and the Tyrians stopped laughing. The channel near the island ran much deeper, dropping to perhaps 18 feet or more, and the seabed fell away beneath the fill as the soft bottom shifted under the weight. Every foot of progress now demanded enormous quantities of material, hurled into water that swallowed it without a trace, and the further the mole reached, the more exposed its narrow leading edge became. And the Tyrians, with full command of the sea around the unfinished tip of the mole, began to attack in earnest. Their warships, lighter and faster than anything Alexander could put on the water, sailed up to the flanks of the causeway and raked the laboring soldiers with arrows, sling stones, and missiles from both sides at once. The workers, hauling stone with their hands and backs, wore no armor and carried no shields. You cannot dig in a breastplate. And they had no cover at all out on the open spit of new-made land. To protect them, Alexander erected 2 great siege towers at the far end of the mole. The tallest such towers the sources describe in the whole campaign, sheathed in rawhide and green skins to resist fire, and mounted catapults and stone throwers on their upper levels to drive the ships back beyond missile range. For a time, it worked. The towers gave the workers a shield to labor behind, and the mole crept forward again. And here the Tyrians produced one of the most brilliant counterstrokes of the ancient world. This is the second open loop paying off, the moment the marvel became a trap. They took an old transport ship, a horse carrier with a broad beam, and they turned it into a weapon. Into the hull they loaded dry brushwood, pitch, sulfur, and every flammable substance they could find. They built out the bow with 2 projecting yard arms, and from those arms they hung cauldrons of oil and bitumen, positioned so that when the masts burned through and toppled, the cauldrons would spill their contents forward onto whatever the bow had struck. They weighted the stern down heavily with sand and stone so that the bow rode high out of the water, high enough to ride up and over any obstacle at the end of the mole rather than simply nosing into it. Then, picking a day with a strong onshore wind blowing straight toward the mole, they towed this floating bomb with a pair of triremes, the rowers building up its speed across the channel, and at the last moment cast it loose so that its own momentum and the wind ran it aground directly against Alexander's 2 siege towers. The crew set it ablaze and dove into the sea to be picked up by waiting boats. The wind did the rest. The fire ship's high bow drove up onto the end of the causeway exactly as the Tyrians had engineered it to. The masts cracked and dumped their cauldrons of burning oil across the towers, and the whole forward structure of the mole became an inferno. And the Tyrians had timed it as a combined operation. As the fire took hold, their warships swept in from both harbors, and crews in small boats rowed in among the wreckage, landing men who tore down the protective screens, smashed the catapults the flames had not yet reached, and dragged off the stakes and timbers that held the seaward face of the mole together. In a single afternoon, weeks of brutal labor, and both towers were gone, and the leading edge of the causeway was a smoking ruin pounded by the surf. Most commanders would have read that fire as the verdict. Alexander read it as a delay. He ordered the mole rebuilt, this time wider, broad enough to carry more towers and to present a larger frontage to the sea, and angled differently to face the prevailing wind that the Tyrians had used against him. But the fire ship had taught him the lesson that would actually win the siege. As long as the Tyrians controlled the water, no causeway, however wide, could ever be safe. The enemy could always strike its flanks and its tip faster than he could defend them. The land bridge alone would never be enough. To take Tyre, he needed to do the one thing he supposedly could not do. He needed a navy. And this is the reversal that nobody saw coming. Alexander did not build a fleet, he collected one. His campaign down the coast had already brought other Phoenician cities under his control, Byblos, Sidon, and the island city of Abydos, and their kings had been away serving in the Persian navy with their squadrons. When those cities submitted to Alexander, the calculation of their absent kings changed overnight. Word reached the Phoenician contingents in Persian service that their home cities, their families, and their property now belonged to the Macedonian. A captain whose wife and children were in Sidon was not going to keep fighting for a Persian king who could no longer protect them. So the Phoenician squadrons peeled away from the Persian fleet and sailed home. And from home, they sailed to Alexander and placed themselves at his disposal. The sources report around 80 ships from Sidon, Byblos, and Abydos together, though the figures vary between accounts. Then the kings of Cyprus, hearing that Isis had broken Persian power on land and that the Phoenician coast had gone over, made the same cold arithmetic and sent their squadrons too, reportedly some 120 ships by the sources' count. A handful of others came in from Rhodes and the Lycian and Cilician coasts. Almost overnight, by the strategic act of having conquered the coast rather than the water, Alexander assembled a fleet the sources number at around 220 ships, a round total that modern historians read as an approximation rather than a precise count. He had not laid a single keel. The very seamanship that made Tyre strong, the Phoenician mastery of the sea, was suddenly his, because Tyre was no longer the only Phoenician city, and now it stood alone against all the others. Its own cousins, the kindred cities of the Phoenician coast, would crew the ships that drowned it. The Tyrians woke one morning to a sight that must have stopped their hearts. The man they had mocked for trying to build a road through the ocean now had more warships in those waters than they did. He sailed his fleet down from Sidon in full battle order and offered battle off the city. The Tyrians, badly outnumbered and unwilling to gamble their whole strength in one open fight, declined to come out, and instead blockaded the mouths of their own 2 harbors with their remaining ships, anchored bow on across the entrances and chained together to make a wall of hulls. Alexander split his fleet to seal both harbors, the Cypriots watching the northern Sidonian harbor, the Phoenicians the southern Egyptian harbor, and the siege had inverted. The masters of the sea were now penned inside their own walls, and the king, without a navy, held the open water on every side. What followed was a methodical, grinding reduction of the most defended city on earth. Alexander brought up ships fitted with battering rams, lashing pairs of vessels together side by side to make stable, broad platforms that would not roll when the rams swung, and rode them against the walls. He mounted catapults and torsion engines on others to clear the ramparts of defenders while the rams worked. The Tyrians fought back with everything human ingenuity could devise, and their defense is a catalogue of horrors aimed at any man who came near the stone. They dropped great blocks of masonry into the water at the base of the walls to keep the ram ships from getting close, building an underwater rampart of fallen stone. When Alexander's men brought up ships with cranes to grapple and drag those blocks away, the Tyrians sent armored diving crews down to cut the tow lines underwater, and others rowed out in protected boats to slice the cables that held the attacking ships in position, so that the whole assault platform drifted helplessly. They strung wheels in front of the engines that spun and deflected the incoming bolts. They cast fishing nets and weighted lines from the ramparts to entangle attacking soldiers and haul them bodily off the assault ladders. They dropped grappling hooks and great curved blades on chains to cut into the men clustered on the gangways. And most terrible of all, they heated sand and fine metal shavings in great bronze shields and braziers over fires until it glowed red, then poured it down onto the Macedonians below. The burning sand worked its way down inside breastplates and under clothing, where it could not be brushed off or reached, and there was no removing it. It ate into the skin and kept burning. Men tore at their own armor in agony, ripping off their protection in the middle of the assault and threw themselves from the ladders and gangways to escape it, only to fall to the missiles or the sea. The sources describe it as one of the cruelest weapons in the entire history of ancient siege warfare, and it broke assault after assault before it could reach the wall. For 7 months it went on, from roughly January to August of 332. 7 months of mole building and fire and grinding rams against stone that had never been broken, of probing the whole circuit of the walls for a weak seam, of attacks beaten back by burning sand and severed cables. The northern and landward walls were the thickest and held firm against everything Alexander threw at them. Then, at last, the ram ships found a weakness in the southern stretch of wall, on the side facing Egypt. The stone there began to crack under repeated battering. A section gave way, and a breach opened. Alexander did not pour men in at once into a gap the defenders had already rushed to plug. He pulled his ships back, gave his crews 2 days to rest while a storm blew through, rebuilt and widened the assault platforms, and waited for calm water. Then he came on with everything at once. The main assault drove through the breach in the southern wall on bridged gangways run out from the ram ships, while his fleet forced both harbors simultaneously, the Cypriots breaking into the northern harbor and the Phoenicians into the southern, splitting the defenders in 3 directions and denying them any single point to concentrate on. Alexander himself led the storming party from a ship's gangway onto the broken rampart, with the elite of the Macedonian guard, the Hypaspists, around him. And the commander Admetus, leading the first wave, was killed beside him on the wall. The first defenders to meet him at the breach were cut down. Once the Macedonians had a firm foothold on the wall and seized the towers flanking the breach, the city's geometry, which had protected it for centuries, became its tomb. There was nowhere for the Tyrians to retreat to. They were on an island, surrounded, with a hostile fleet now inside both harbors and an enemy pouring over the southern wall and fanning out along the ramparts. The fighting collapsed back through the narrow streets toward the Temple of Melkart and the strongest buildings around the Agenorium, where the last and most desperate of the defense made its stand. And there it was destroyed in close, building-by-building slaughter. And now the arithmetic, which is the reason this siege is remembered with a particular shudder. Hold the question I planted at the very beginning. Why did roughly 9 in 10 of the defenders die when surrender and ransom were the ordinary currency of ancient war, when a captured city's people were, more often than not, a resource to be sold or taxed rather than slaughtered? The answer is that Alexander made a decision, and the decision was strategic, not merely furious, though there was fury in it too. 7 months of resistance had cost him heavily in men, in time, and in prestige before the whole watching eastern Mediterranean at the very moment Darius was regrouping in the interior and a Spartan revolt smoldered in Greece. The killing of his envoys at the start, the bodies thrown from the walls, and a final atrocity the sources record that the Tyrians had, in the course of the siege, dragged some captured Macedonian prisoners onto the battlements and butchered them in full view of the army, throwing the bodies into the sea. All of it demanded an answer that every other city watching would understand without a word of explanation. So when Tyre fell, the reckoning was total. Arrian records around 8,000 Tyrians killed in the storming and the sack of the city. Macedonian losses across the entire 7-month siege are given as comparatively light. Arrian puts the dead at only some 400 men, a testament to how much of the work was done by engine and ship rather than by hand-to-hand assault until the very end. Of those who survived the storming, the sources say roughly 30,000. The bulk of them, the city's women, children, and remaining inhabitants, were sold into slavery, a round figure the ancient writers give that modern historians treat with caution, a number that, sold across the slave markets of the eastern Mediterranean, both punished the city and helped pay for the war. 2,000 men of fighting age, by Curtius's account, were crucified along the shore as a warning, nailed up in a long line where every passing ship would see them. A mercy was extended to a few, those who had taken refuge in the temple of Melkart, including the Tyrian king Azamilcus, and certain envoys from Carthage were spared for the sake of the god whose protection they had claimed.
When you set the dead and the enslaved against the small number who escaped, some Tyrians were quietly sheltered and smuggled out by Sidonian sailors in Alexander's own fleet, who could not bring themselves to see their Phoenician kin annihilated. And others, perhaps 15,000 by one account, had been evacuated by ship to Carthage before the end. The proportion of the defending population that was killed or carried off in chains reaches that grim figure of around 9 in 10, and that 90% is a modern estimate built from the ancient totals the sources give us, not a single figure any one ancient writer records. So read it as the arithmetic of those reported numbers rather than a census. The city as a living community simply ceased to exist. The people who had held the unconquerable island for many centuries did not lose a battle. They were erased as an example. And the example worked, which was the whole point of it. After Tyre, the city of Gaza, under its commander Battus, resisted for 2 more months and was likewise stormed and savagely punished. But most of the coast and then Egypt opened their gates rather than face what Tyre had faced. Egypt welcomed Alexander almost without a fight, and there he would found Alexandria. The Persian fleet, stripped of its Phoenician and Cypriot bases, its crews gone home, and its harbors closed against it, dissolved as a threat. Within a year, the islands and coasts it had recaptured fell away from it, and the naval war in the Aegean collapsed. And the Spartan revolt under Agis, deprived of Persian sea power to sustain it, was crushed soon after. Alexander turned inland to chase Darius with his back finally secure, his supply line down the coast safe, and no enemy fleet able to threaten Greece behind him. He had spent 7 months and a great deal of blood on a single island, and in doing so, he had won the entire Mediterranean coast, neutralized a navy he could never have beaten ship for ship, and made his march into the heart of Persia possible. The longest, hardest siege of his career bought him the freedom to win everything that came after. Now, here is the move that almost no telling of this siege brings forward, the detail that turns Tyre from a story about cruelty into a story about engineering that outlived the engineer. That causeway, the mole Alexander built across 1/2 mile of open sea, it never went away. Over the centuries that followed, the currents of the Mediterranean, which run along that coast and carry suspended sand and silt with them, met the artificial barrier he had thrown across the channel and slowed where it stood. Sediment drops out of slow-moving water, and so it began to settle and pile against both sides of the man-made land bridge, year after year, decade after decade, a process geographers call a tombolo, sand building up in the still water behind an obstruction until it bridges the gap entirely. The narrow road of rubble broadened into a permanent neck of land. The island became a peninsula. Today, Tyre is no longer an island at all. It is connected to the mainland of Lebanon by a wide isthmus several hundred meters across, built up and inhabited, and the foundation buried beneath all that accumulated sand is the very stone, timber, and rubble that Alexander's soldiers drowned in the sea in 332 before the Common Era, and beneath that,
the dismantled bones of old Tyre, the mainland city he tore down to feed the channel. He did not just break the city, he rewrote the map, and the map has stayed rewritten for more than 2,300 years. No flood, no earthquake, no later conqueror has undone it. The next time you see a satellite image of the Lebanese coast, look for the broad headland where Tyre sits, jutting out from the shore. You are looking at the largest siege work in ancient history, still there, fossilized into the shape of the coastline itself. If this account held your attention through all 7 months of the siege, the single most useful thing you can do is press the like button and subscribe to the channel.
Every subscriber tells the algorithm to carry these stories to one more person who thought they already knew how Alexander conquered the world. And if you know someone who loves history, an armchair strategist, anyone who would appreciate the story of the road built through the ocean to break an unbreakable wall, send them this video. It is the rare siege where the weapon used to win it is still visible from space. I will see you in the next one.